3 horses. That's what Uncle Jeremiah said she was worth when he handed her over like a sack of grain. Ruthie Lark stood in the dust of Eli Bannister's farmyard, her small fists clenched around a cloth bundle that held everything she owned, watching the only family she'd ever known disappear into the Missouri heat. The silence stretched between her and the weathered farmer until it felt like a rope about to snap. Then she looked up at him with eyes too old for 9 years and asked the question that would change everything. "Can you be my father?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Eli felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for years, subscribed to witness how a simple question can rebuild 2 broken hearts. The dust hadn't settled from Jeremiah's wagon wheels when Eli Bannister realized he was staring at a child who didn't cry. Ruthie Lark stood in his farmyard like a fence post driven deep into hard ground, her brown hair braided tight against her skull, her dress patched in 3 places with fabric that didn't match. She clutched a bundle wrapped in faded calico, and her eyes, Lord, those eyes, held the kind of stillness that comes from learning too young that tears change nothing. The afternoon sun beat down merciless on the Missouri prairie, turning the air thick as molasses, but she didn't seek shade or shelter. She just stood there, waiting for him to decide what to do with her. Eli's throat worked like he was trying to swallow a stone. 3 horses, Jeremiah had said. 3 horses to settle a debt that had been eating at the man's conscience for 2 years running. The girl was worth 3 horses to a man who couldn't feed her, and now she was standing in Eli's yard, like a question he didn't know how to answer. He'd been alone on this farm for so long that the sound of another person breathing felt foreign, unsettling. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the corn that was already turning brown at the edges. Summer was dying early this year, and everything felt brittle, ready to break. "You hungry?" The words came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of talking mostly to himself and his animals. Ruthie's eyes flicked to his face, studying him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read danger in a man's expression. She nodded once, a sharp little movement that reminded him of a bird testing the air for threats. Her bundle shifted in her arms, and he caught a glimpse of something blue, maybe a dress, maybe a doll. The sight of it hit him sideways, a reminder that she was still a child, despite the ancient wariness in her eyes. Children needed things. They needed care and patience and 100 small kindnesses he'd forgotten how to give. The farmhouse squatted low and weathered behind him, its windows dark as empty eye sockets. He'd built it with his own hands 15 years ago, back when he'd believed in futures and family and all the promises that life had since broken. Now it felt too big and too small all at once. Too big for one man's loneliness, too small for the weight of all his ghosts. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, where the foundation had shifted, and the paint had long since given up trying to stay white. It wasn't much to offer a child, but it was what he had. The barn was in better shape at least. Solid and clean and filled with the honest smell of hay and horses. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe it would have to be. Ruthie took a step toward the house, then stopped, her head tilted like she was listening for something. The prairie wind caught her skirt and made it flutter around her thin legs, and Eli noticed how her shoes were worn through at the toes, how her stockings had been darned so many times they were more thread than original fabric. Jeremiah hadn't been lying when he'd said times were hard. The girl looked like she'd been living on hope and not much else for longer than any child should. Her fingers tightened on her bundle, and she looked up at him again with those 2 old eyes. "Can you be my father?" she asked, and the words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Eli thought he knew about his life. The question hung in the air, simple and impossible all at once. Father. The word tasted like ashes in his mouth, like all the dreams he'd buried in the little grave behind the house where wildflowers grew now, instead of the daughter he'd never gotten to hold. He'd been a father once, for exactly 7 minutes, long enough to count tiny fingers and toes, before the silence stretched too long, and the midwife's face went soft with pity. That had been 8 years ago, and he'd thought the wanting was dead and buried with everything else. But here was this child, asking him to be something he'd failed at before he'd even had the chance to try. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky the color of old blood, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out its lonely song. Supper was a silent affair, conducted in the yellow glow of a single oil lamp that threw their shadows large and wavering against the kitchen walls. Eli had heated beans and cornbread, simple fare that filled the belly without asking for conversation, and Ruthie ate with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned not to waste food. She sat across from him at the scarred wooden table, her feet not quite touching the floor, her bundle placed carefully beside her chair like a faithful dog. Every few bites, she would glance up at him through her lashes, quick little looks that reminded him of a wild animal testing whether it was safe to stay or time to run. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to say. When she finished eating, Ruthie folded her hands in her lap and waited. She didn't ask for seconds, didn't complain about the simple meal, didn't fidget or whine like he imagined most children would. Instead, she sat still as carved wood, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Eli found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her hair had worked loose from its braid in wispy tendrils that caught the light. She had good bones, strong features that would serve her well when she grew into them, but there was something fragile about her too, something that made him think of bird wings and spun glass, things that could shatter if handled too roughly. "There's a room upstairs," he said finally, the words coming out stilted and awkward. "Used to be." He stopped, swallowed hard, started again. "It's got a bed and a window that looks out over the cornfield. You can have it if you want." Ruthie nodded solemnly, like he'd offered her something precious instead of a dusty room that hadn't been opened in years. She picked up her bundle and stood, then hesitated, her small hand resting on the back of her chair. For a moment, he thought she might say something, might ask another impossible question, or make another request he didn't know how to fulfill. Instead, she just looked at him with those ancient eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Bannister." The sound of her footsteps on the stairs was lighter than rain on the roof, barely there at all. Eli sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the old house settle around him, creaking and sighing like it was trying to remember how to hold more than one person's dreams. Upstairs, he could hear the soft sounds of Ruthie moving around, the whisper of fabric, the gentle thud of small feet on wooden floors. He'd forgotten how different a house felt with another person in it, how the very air seemed to change, becoming warmer somehow, more alive. It scared him, that warmth. He'd grown used to the cold, had wrapped it around himself like armor against all the ways the world could hurt him. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows that made the kitchen feel smaller, more intimate. Eli pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the prairie that stretched endless and dark under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, Jeremiah was probably sleeping off his guilt with a bottle of whiskey, telling himself he'd done what he had to do. Maybe he had. Maybe trading a child for horses was just another kind of survival, another way of making it through another day in a world that didn't much care whether you lived or died. But that didn't make it right, and it didn't make the weight of responsibility sitting on Eli's shoulders any lighter. He'd taken her in, but he didn't know the first thing about raising a child, especially one who'd already learned too much about disappointment. Upstairs, the sounds had stopped. Ruthie was probably lying in the narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man she'd been traded to, and whether he'd keep her, or pass her along to someone else when the novelty wore off. The thought made something twist in Eli's chest. a pain sharp and unexpected as a knife between the ribs. She was just a child, for God's sake, and she'd already been abandoned once. The least he could do was try not to make it twice. He blew out the lamp and made his way upstairs in the dark, his feet finding the familiar path by memory. At the top of the stairs, he paused outside the closed door of what had once been meant as a nursery, listening to the soft sound of breathing from within. The morning came with frost, painting the windows like lace, and Ruthie was already awake when Eli descended the stairs. She sat at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap, watching the steam rise from the coffee pot she had somehow managed to prepare. The sight stopped him in the doorway, not because a 9-year-old had made coffee, but because she had done it without being asked, without expectation of praise, as if service was the only language she knew how to speak. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the pale light filtering through the frost-covered glass, she looked like a ghost of all the daughters he had never had the chance to raise. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, moving toward the stove where bacon waited in the iron skillet. Ruthie's eyes followed his movements, cataloguing each gesture as if she were memorizing the rhythm of his morning routine. "I've been making my own coffee for 20 years. The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw her shoulders tense, saw the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table. He had meant to be kind, but kindness was a skill he had let atrophy, like muscles unused too long. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of grease popping in the pan and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields beyond. She ate her breakfast in careful, measured bites, never taking more than what was offered, never asking for seconds, even when he could see hunger lingering in her eyes. Eli found himself watching her from the corner of his vision, noting the way she held her fork like a weapon, the way she kept her back straight, as if ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When she finished, she carried her plate to the wash basin without being told, her movements precise and economical. "Uncle Jeremiah said I eat too much," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Said that's why he had to trade me." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he set down his coffee cup harder than necessary, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. "Your uncle was a fool," Eli said, the words rough with an anger that surprised him. He had not meant to speak so plainly, but the sight of this small girl, apologizing for her own hunger, had awakened something fierce and protective in his chest. Ruthie looked up at him with wide eyes, as if no one had ever contradicted Uncle Jeremiah's pronouncements before. A man who trades away his kin for horses doesn't deserve to have an opinion about anything. He stood abruptly, needing movement to contain the rage that threatened to spill over. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard like lost souls searching for shelter. The day passed in a series of small revelations, each one adding weight to the growing understanding between them. Ruthie followed him through his chores with the persistence of a shadow, never getting in the way, but always present, always watching. When he mended a broken fence post, she handed him nails before he asked for them. When he fed the chickens, she scattered grain with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She spoke little, but her presence filled the spaces his solitude had carved hollow. By evening, when they sat down to supper, Eli realized that the house felt different, not just occupied, but inhabited, as if something that had been sleeping for years was finally beginning to stir. As darkness settled over the prairie like a familiar blanket, Ruthie helped him clear the dishes, her small hands sure and steady as she dried each plate and cup. "Mr. Bannister," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable quiet that had settled between them. Do you think maybe I could stay?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from the dying fire, and Eli felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long he had forgotten it was there. He looked down at this fierce, fragile girl who had been traded like livestock, but still had the courage to ask for love, and knew that his answer would change everything for both of them. 3 weeks passed, like pages turning in a book written in a language Eli was slowly learning to read. Ruthie's presence had settled into the rhythms of the farm like water finding its level, and he found himself listening for the sound of her bare feet on the wooden floors, the soft humming she did while she worked, the way she talked to the animals as if they were old friends who understood her secrets. She had claimed the rocking chair by the fireplace as her own, and in the evenings she would sit there, mending his shirts with stitches so small and perfect they looked like prayers sewn into the fabric. Her fingers moved with the skill of someone who had learned necessity early, and watching her work filled him with a mixture of admiration and sorrow for the childhood she had never been allowed to have. The first time she laughed, it caught him completely off guard. They were in the barn, and one of the barn cats had gotten itself tangled in a ball of twine, rolling and tumbling in increasingly ridiculous contortions as it tried to free itself. The sound that escaped Ruthie's lips was rusty, as if laughter was a skill she had almost forgotten how to use, but it was genuine and bright, and it transformed her entire face. Eli found himself smiling in response, the expression feeling strange on his features after so many years of solemnity. "Silly old Tom," she said, untangling the cat with gentle hands. "You're worse than a kitten." The cat purred and rubbed against her legs, and Eli realized that animals, like children, had an instinct for recognizing kindness that adults often lost. She began to ask questions then, tentative at first, as if testing the boundaries of his patience. She wanted to know about the farm, about the seasons, about why he had chosen this particular piece of land to call home. Her curiosity was careful but genuine, and Eli found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining the mysteries of crop rotation and weather patterns, the personalities of individual animals, the way the land changed with each passing season. "My pa never talked to me about such things," she said one afternoon as they watched storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Said girls didn't need to know about farming." Eli felt that familiar anger rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, focusing instead on the way Ruthie's eyes tracked the movement of the clouds with the intensity of someone learning to read the sky. The storm, when it came, was fierce and sudden, driving them both into the house with sheets of rain that turned the world grey and wild. They sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, and Ruthie moved her chair closer to his without asking permission. "Are you afraid of storms?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the thunder. Eli considered the question seriously, remembering his own childhood fears, the way his mother used to hold him during the worst of the weather. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've learned that most storms pass if you wait them out." She nodded as if this was wisdom worth remembering, and when lightning split the sky, she didn't flinch, though her small hand found his arm and held on tight. When morning came, the world was washed clean and sparkling, and they walked through the aftermath together, assessing damage and marveling at the way the earth seemed to exhale relief. A tree had fallen across the path to the well, and as they worked together to clear it, Ruthie's sleeve caught on a broken branch, tearing the fabric from wrist to elbow. She stared at the ruined shirt with something approaching panic, and Eli realized she was calculating the cost of replacement, wondering if this mistake would be enough to make him send her away. "It's just cloth," he said gently, and the relief that flooded her face was so profound it made his chest ache. "We'll get you new shirts when we go to town next week." That evening, as they sat down to supper, Ruthie looked across the table at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Bannister," she said carefully, "when you go to town, are you planning to take me with you?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, and Eli understood that she was really asking if he intended to keep her, if this fragile thing they were building together had any permanence. He set down his fork and looked at her directly, this brave little girl who had been traded away but still had the courage to hope. "Ruthie," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you're not going anywhere unless you want to." The town of Cedar Falls sprawled along the banks of the Missouri River, like a collection of wooden boxes someone had scattered and forgotten to arrange properly. Eli guided the wagon down the main street, acutely aware of Ruthie sitting beside him in her new blue dress. The first thing he had bought her that wasn't born of necessity but of want, of the desire to see her eyes light up the way they had when she saw the fabric in the mercantile window. She sat straight-backed and alert, taking in everything with the intensity of someone seeing the world through new eyes, and he found himself seeing the familiar sights through her perspective, the way the church steeple caught the morning light, the sound of children playing in the schoolyard, the bustle of people going about their daily business with the easy confidence of those who belonged somewhere. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was the first to notice them, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Ruthie's appearance with the thoroughness of a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's. "Well, Eli Bannister," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for gossip that was too delicious to keep to herself. "I heard you'd taken in a child, but I had to see it with my own eyes." Ruthie pressed closer to his side, and Eli felt her tension like a vibration in the air between them. "This is Ruthie," he said simply, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and claiming. "She's living with me now." The words felt strange in his mouth, but right, as if he had been practicing them in his sleep for weeks. The questions came like arrows, shot from a dozen different directions. Where had she come from? Who were her people? What were his intentions regarding her future? Eli answered what he could and deflected what he couldn't, all the while keeping one eye on Ruthie's face, watching for signs that the attention was becoming too much. She handled it with a composure that broke his heart, answering direct questions with polite brevity, never volunteering more information than was asked for. When Mrs. Patterson from the church auxiliary suggested that perhaps Ruthie would benefit from the structure of the orphanage in Kansas City, Eli felt something cold and sharp settle in his stomach. "She has a home," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several people step back. "She doesn't need another one." The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge when they encountered Tom Brewster outside the bank, his face flushed with whiskey and his eyes bright with the particular malice of a man who enjoyed other people's discomfort. "Heard you bought yourself a little girl, Bannister," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Funny how a man who couldn't keep his own wife alive thinks he can raise someone else's child." The words hit like physical blows, and Eli felt his hands clench into fists, felt the familiar rage rise in his throat like bile. But before he could respond, Ruthie stepped forward, her small chin raised in defiance. "Mr. Bannister is a good man," she said, her voice clear and strong, "better than some who call themselves men." The silence that followed was profound, and Tom Brewster had the grace to look ashamed before he stumbled away. They finished their business in town, with a new understanding between them, forged in the crucible of public scrutiny and mutual defense. On the ride home, Ruthie was quiet for a long time, watching the familiar landscape roll past with thoughtful eyes. "People talk," she said finally, her voice matter-of-fact rather than hurt. "They always have something to say about folks who don't fit their idea of how things should be." Eli glanced at her, surprised by the wisdom in her words, the way she had distilled the afternoon's experiences into something manageable. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What they say." She considered this seriously, her small hands folded in her lap. "Not anymore," she said. "I know who I am now. I know where I belong." As they turned into the lane that led to the farmhouse, the setting sun painted everything golden, and Eli felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completeness, of rightness, as if all the broken pieces of his life had finally found their proper places. Ruthie looked up at him with a smile that was no longer careful or guarded, but open and trusting, and he realized that somewhere in the space between her arrival and this moment, they had become something neither of them had expected, a family. "Thank you," she said quietly as they pulled up to the house, "for taking me to town, for letting people know I belong to you." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, and Eli knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.